Welcome to another lecture where I'm going to be discussing a little bit of a more, I wouldn't say controversial, but it's definitely a topic that will get some conversations or discussions going. And this is going to be about, what has been propagated a lot recently in recent times. If you follow Ice Cube on Twitter, you might have noticed that he was tweeting, some controversial topics at hand, most notably dealing with, let's say, just Jewish symbolism. A lot of people equated that as anti-Semitic. I happen to disagree with that notion. I think it's kind of stupid to, equate symbolic representation as inherently being entirely against a group of people. But I will want to discuss this topic because I think it's, first of all, very misunderstood, and on top of that, it's utilized in a way that's, antagonistic, I would say. And that's the topic of the cube. So I have a cube here. This is made out of shungite. You can get something like this on Amazon for about $15. This kind of material is good to protect yourself from EMFs with all this 5G stuff. Personally, I'm not really someone who thinks that it's going to kill everyone or it's responsible for COVID, but I do think that, in case there are some problems with that kind of technology relating to health, it's good to have, kind of some base elements and materials that you can get that will protect you and sort of ground you out, so you're not constantly battered by electromagnetic frequencies. And this kind of material is really good for that. And I got this nice material in a cube. So shungite is a meteorite, I believe, that's found in Russia. I'm not really sure, don't quote me on that. But so apparently it's really good for that. And I've kind of felt the effects energetically just even touching it. There is a kind of different charge to it that's different than if you're just holding any normal piece of whatever, a rock or what have you. So this is definitely cool to have, but it definitely ties into the aspect of the cube, specifically the black cube that Ice Cube was mentioning. And, we'll go right off here. If we're going to draw a cube, for instance here, so you have a square here, and then you draw the cube. I fucked that up. But anyway, what you can see from this cube here is if you start doing triangles on each side, it's not very nice, but you get the idea. It turns into the Star of David or the Seal of Solomon. And this is obviously a very poorly drawn one. If I was to do it more in the traditional aspect of what you would normally see, that's what it generally looks like, the Star of David. So, this is where the hexagram and that shape, that polygon shape, originate from, and what it represents. It represents a cube, because when you look at a cube from a certain angle, it takes on the shape of a hexagram. So, that's pretty much where this whole basis comes from. And you'll probably see this in memes, especially, esoteric, occult memes that sort of pop up now and again. And, they kind of equate this as like, oh, look at this, it's sinister Jewish mysticism spells that they're putting on you. Because it represents a box, and, they don't really explain what that means or what that's supposed to represent. They just point this fact out, and you're supposed to just feel offended, I guess, or afraid of the symbol as being demonic or whatever. It's kind of irrelevant. That's pretty much what I see these symbols being utilized as, and it kind of bothers me for many reasons. The main reason is that it's kind of false to sort of just classify this as demonic or satanic. And, the reason why is because this is a balanced symbol, right? this symbol isn't pointing in any direction or any motif. There's no theme generally to what this represents in terms of this is good, this is bad. It's an entirely neutral standpoint, as you can see, because all the stars and all the points of the star are pointing in every direction, so to speak. You know, if you want to look at it from a logical, rational perspective, the star on its own is not going in any direction. And because of that, it's neutral. It's not good or bad. It's not light or dark. It simply is what it is. And we have the black cube here, which I'll get into why, you know, he specifically talks about it being black and not any other color. Why is that? But we'll get into that. I have some theories of my own. But I will show you aspects of, you know, shapes generally that are utilized to illustrate good or bad. The most common ones you will find are the pentagrams. So if I, hold on, there we go. It's a pretty bad pentagram. I don't know if you can see it on there. Yeah. So these are the two pentagrams that you would probably see. Generally, this one means good, this one means evil. You know, that's kind of a very vague, I would say, naive interpretation of what these two mean. But that's basically the gist of what you're going to get. This one's pointing upwards towards heaven. This one's pointing down towards earth. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And you have two supporting points here that are kind of giving it a boost upwards. With the Star of David, there is no direction that it's going specifically. There's no point that it's moving up towards. It's not like a triangle. And that's the interesting thing about the Star of David, or the Seal of Solomon, whatever you want to call it, is that first of all, this kind of symbol originates in a lot of different cultures. And there's a lot of history towards this symbol that I feel like is very misunderstood by many people as just being this demonic thing. One of the aspects that I'm also going to talk about is the fact that this hexagram that's in the middle of the star here, you can find that on, if you look at the planet Saturn and you look at its north pole, there is a hexagon-shaped storm that is on top of Saturn. And Saturn is specifically traditionally known as being Satan, as being the ruler of time. It's generally seen as a very malefic planet in astrology. And I do agree with that aspect. Saturn isn't exactly the good guy in the story. Saturn can be pretty damn harsh, lays down the law, lays down a lot of aspects of Saturnian concepts, if you want to call it that. So, but how does this differ from the hexagon? We'll get into that in a little bit. But I want to focus a little bit more on the pentagrams here. As I said, one goes to heaven, one goes to earth. And this is where we're going to see more satanic aspects are following this, because Satan, or it's not even Satan, because of, you know, these terms kind of get thrown around a lot. Any kind of demonic being or entity or God that isn't, you know, the divine source of all life and all of creation just kind of gets lumped into one category as just being Satan, even though in the Bible and everywhere in Scripture they talk about multiple different demons and different gods and deities that you shouldn't worship. If you do, then you shouldn't do that, which is idolatry. And there's a whole, you know, talk that you could talk about idolatry and why that's toxic for your being, so to speak. So this is pretty much just pointing down into the earth. So you're not really going to find Satan necessarily, but this is dealing with the underworld being where Beelzebub lives and all the other weird entities that exist underneath the earth. And it's kind of interesting because recently scientists have discovered that there are structures underneath this earth's surface. It's not just this, you know, pool of molten lava. There's actually like structural points of, you know, whether those are caves or just giant rocks or boulders is difficult to say, but there's definitely a whole other world underneath the earth's surface that we don't know anything about. We kind of just make conjectures about what we see. And this is what this symbol represents. So if you want to talk about darkness and the underworld and those kinds of things and what symbols represent that, this is the more generalized concept, and you're going to see this in satanic churches, and people are using this. They're not using this. And there's a very clear reason why. because this doesn't mean the underworld, it doesn't mean anything. And just because there is a hexagon shape on Saturn doesn't mean that this is Saturn's seal necessarily. It's a part of Saturn, but there's a very clear reason why that is on Saturn, because Saturn has a role to play. Saturn has a job to play, a divine role to play in the universe and in this specific solar system. Because this symbol is kind of beyond what is Saturn. Saturn didn't create this symbol. The symbol was put on top of Saturn for a reason. Saturn was given a role to play, like I said. So let's take a look and dissect this symbol, so to speak. And as I said, it's two triangles. One is pointing up, the other pointing down. So that's why I said it's a neutral symbol. It's a balanced symbol because you have a triangle going up, triangle going down. What goes up must go down. So if you want to think of it in that context, that is what the symbol represents. It represents the law. It represents structure, order. This is how the universe works in terms of the physical universe, the universe that we are experiencing in our physical bodies. If we go out into outer space in the universe, this law here is going to be represented everywhere in the universe so long as we're in the physical plane of existence. And if you want to talk about being in the fourth dimension or the fifth dimension, you can go ahead, but it's going to be kind of insanely difficult to discuss because we're dealing with dimensions of reality that we're just not bred into. We're not born into those dimensions to understand. So we understand the universe and the world through this context, right? So that's what this is. It's the universe, the six sides of the cube. The cube represents the physical universe. This is it, right? This is where we exist in. There's no other place to go. There's no other law. There's no way to bend the laws of this universe. The only way to do that is to escape from it, to go to the other side of it. And this is where we're going to go into different aspects of thought, different religions, different philosophies, because it's all present in the world, especially within Judaism, in Kabbalah more specifically, and as well as in Taoism and the I Ching. The I Ching expands upon this even further. It goes way more in depth in terms of the hexagram and in terms of the six sides of all matters of life, right? And this is going to be noted in Buddhism as well, and Buddhism, we'll talk about that a little bit too. But I want to illustrate this more so people can understand that the hexagram represents the law. It represents the law of the universe. And that's what Judaism, primarily as a religion, is really based upon. It's based off the Torah. And the Torah is the law. It's the law of the universe, of how we conduct our lives. And that's what a lot of Jewish people and rabbis sort of discuss a lot about. They discuss about the law. How do we conduct ourselves in the universe? How does the universe actually work? How does it function? How do we, what's legal process, all of the legal processes and all of the laws that have existed, especially in the Western world. It's different in the East, in different countries, but specifically if we're looking at like America, Canada, Europe, whatever, it's all based around this. It's all based around the law. It's all based about Judeo-Christian concepts of what's right and wrong, and everything within the legal system is based off of this. And there's a very clear reason why, if you look at sheriffs and not necessarily police officers, but just sheriffs, people in authorities of power, they wear a metal Star of David. They wear the metal hexagram because they represent the law, right? But they themselves are not the law. They're just wearing a shield that represents the law. And this is what's important to understand when we see a hexagram on top of Saturn, because that's what Saturn really is. Saturn is sort of the gatekeeper. He's the dungeon master, is what I kind of like to equate Saturn as, equating him as this evil demonic energy that's going against the will of God is kind of ridiculous. God is everything. God is absolute. There is no being that's necessarily against God or God is trying to fight against, because God is absolute. God is everything and nothing all at once. So saying that kind of weird, naive Christian ideologies that are based around like good versus evil, it's childish. Let's be real. So what Saturn's role is in this world is to make sure the law is put in place, that time is put in place, that everything that we exist in and how we conduct our lives is rooted in the law of our solar system, which is Saturn. And that's why there's a hexagram on there, because that's what it's trying to tell us, because we have to follow the law. No matter who we are, no matter who we think we are, no matter how special we are, no matter how vegan we are, and if we're a breatharian, and if we've, attained enlightenment, when we come back into this world and we engage in the real world, we still have to follow the law, right? And this is very important to look at, because we need to understand the law in order for us to actually utilize it for our benefit. And this is where we can get into these concepts, right, of good versus evil, heaven versus earth. And this is kind of a concept in the West where we sort of see, the heavenly path as the only good path, and the earthly path as being the evil path. Stay away from the earth path. We must become one with Jesus and God and all this other stuff. So that's generally what this sort of represents. And I know a lot of my viewers are people who sort of dislike Jewish ideas, and me personally, they think I'm a reptilian. That's perfectly fine. You're allowed to think whatever you want, but you need to realize that this kind of way of thinking of good versus evil it works in the sense of like trying to make things to the best benefit for yourself and for the people around you, and trying to make life enjoyable while we're here, because this is a game, right? This is a game of the world. But I'll get into that a little bit. I have a lot of things I want to discuss here, so I'm kind of going through this pretty quickly. But yeah, so this is generally the game that we're playing in. And that's why the number 5 specifically in numerology can kind of represent a king, or represent authority, represent an emperor, because 5, before it gets to 6, which 6 is kind of, you're at the max, you're at the peak, you're at the limit of everything. 5 is kind of like the stable zone right before that, where you're on a plateau, you're in charge of everything, right? And this is where we can get into the I Ching, and that's the concepts where it goes way more in depth in terms of the hexagram and what it represents. So now I'm going to tie this into Buddhism, right? Where what the number 6 represents. And what the number 6 represents a lot of the times, in Buddhism they talk about the 6 thieves, or the 6 senses. Generally, in Western thought, the 6 senses are seen as 5 senses, right? You have touch, smell, hear, see. Hold on. I'm in a lot of different places right now. So you have touch, smell, taste, see, hear. So those are the 5 ones that you have. And with Buddhism, they have a 6th one that is included in that, which is the sense of thought, your thought process, right? This is the aspect of your intellect and your mind, and what you're thinking about, the anxieties that you're always constantly thinking about, like, oh, what if I did this today? What if I did that today? Oh, what if I have to pay this bill by tomorrow, right? That's a sense that happens in your mind, and they include it in this because it represents the 6 aspects of the world that we have to deal with. And 5, if we go back here to 5 being the aspect of, I don't want to say authority, but it's like the mean. It's the symbol of order and kingship, so to speak. So that's why in the West we kind of don't really include thought, because thought is the last one at the edge of everything. Once we've sort of mastered everything in terms of touch, smell, taste, sight, and hearing, those are everything that's in the external world. The 6th one of thought is completely in the head. You're not really experiencing thought outside of your body. You only experience the 5 aspects of the world outside of your body, the 5 senses. So the 6th sense is just your thoughts. It's your thoughts and your ability to rationally think about things, to predict the future, what have you. That's the 6th sense. And with Buddhism, the goal is to get to source, right? To eliminate the need from all of these different aspects of sensory aspects in the universe, and to eliminate all of them so that we can become one with source again, so that we become one with the unity of creation. And this is where we see the tie-in between Eastern and Western thought of Judaism and Taoism and Buddhism coming together. And this is very fascinating because it sort of paints the reality of how these things are actually manifested in the universe. And if we can have two different cultures come to these same conclusions on their own, in their own ways, independently, then it shows the value of those truths. So the holy number being 7, right? 7 is the most holy number. It's used in every single culture pretty much. 7 is like the golden standard. Why is 7 the golden standard? Because if we live in the sixth dimensional world, well, it's not 6 dimensions, but the 6-sided world, the cube, right? So what does 7 represents? It represents beyond 6. Represents beyond 6 in the sense, but 7 doesn't exist really when we think about it. It doesn't exist in this physical world. It doesn't exist in this physical universe. So how can 7 even be a concept that we can grasp ourselves to? And what 7 represents is once, if we look at it from a biblical perspective, and this is also implemented in traditional Chinese medicine, if we look at it from the perspective, God created the earth in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested rather. And why do we say that God rested on the 7th day? Well, what does 7 represent ultimately? If we go to 6 and we go beyond 6, then what is 7? 7 is 0 almost. 7 is the source. It goes back to the creation, the original source of all of life, which was emptiness, right? And that's what 7 ultimately represents in all of this, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing as to why we rest on the 7th day, because 7 as a concept is the place where nothing really existed. It was on the first day that stuff started to become manifested, stuff started to become created, when 1 was created. But before that, when you have 0, that's when everything was emptiness, everything was still, everything was nothing, so to speak. And that's what 7 represents here. And that's important because this is tying into traditional Chinese arts and Judeo-Christian thought. So this is why 7 is very important, and this is why it ties in directly with 6 and the hexagram, and why all of these things are connected, interconnected. And it's very interesting to think about, because when we think about the cube and we think about the physical world, we think about a video game. We think about life as a game. And what is the original game that we can think about? Usually the first game that we've ever played is maybe like chess or something. And what's chess? It's a bunch of squares that you move your pieces in. It's in little squares, but there's also other things that you could play. Like think of the game Monopoly, right? And now what do you do when it's your turn to play Monopoly? You start off not going anywhere. You start off at go. You start off at 0. Start off at 7, so to speak. And then how do you move forward into the game? How do you move forward into the game? How do you buy property? How do you get anywhere in the game? You have to roll a dice, right? So this is where it all comes down to. This is the physical world. The die is the physical world. This is what Saturn and all the aspects of 6 are representing. It's the 6 sides of possibility, the 6 sides of probabilities, right? And that's what you do. You roll the die, and then you get a number by chance, and that's the amount of spaces you can go towards. And this is where everything in terms of where we think about probabilities and chance, ratios, everything within that is coming from inside this box. Inside of this box, because life is a game. Everything's based around chance. And if you talk to professional gamblers, poker players, financiers, traders, stock traders, it's all rooted in chance and probabilities, and making sure that you utilize the probabilities and you understand the probabilities, because when you're dealing with probabilities, you have to understand that there is a probability that something will happen and then something else will happen. So for instance, if I flip a coin, there's a 50-50 chance that it will land on heads or tails. If I flip the coin again, scientists like to say, well, it's always going to be 50-50, but the reality is, because you flipped the coin already in a concept of time, the chance of there being the other outcome increases. So that's how probabilities work. Probability is the law, right? If you flip a coin throughout your entire life a million times over, you know categorically that there will probably be half of that time will be heads, the other half will be tails, even if they're not in the same order, so to speak, and they're not sort of congruent in a very, in a pattern that's recognizable. You still know the law that if you were to flip the coin an infinite amount of times, half of that time would be heads, half that time would be tails. And that's the law that exists in the cube, in the world, in the universe. And that's the same here on Earth and the same 300 million light years away on some distant planet. It's going to be the same because we're all in this box. We're all playing this game. And this is where I want to, delve into other aspects of the game, right? The game of life, the game that we sort of attribute ourselves to, of comparing our lives to a video game, so to speak. And think about all the video game consoles that you've bought in your life. And think about how they've related themselves to the cube. You have the GameCube, you have the Xbox. And then what do we have else that's also very important? That's not necessarily using language like the cube or whatnot, but it utilizes another aspect of the cube that we haven't really talked about yet. And that's the Nintendo 64. So what does 64 mean? And why is 64, that number, even so important? And why was, when Nintendo created the Nintendo 64, everything was 64, right? Every fucking game that was released on the Nintendo 64 was like Mario 64, Samus 64, Fox 64, whatever. Everything was used, this number, 64. Everything was 64. No one did this when it was like 32-bit or 16-bit or 8-bit. No one gave a shit. But when 64-bit came around, and even after 64-bit, people stopped caring. When the Xbox and the PlayStation came out, no one cared if it was like 128-bit or whatever. I don't really know how many bits there are now in the PlayStation 5, for instance. But for some reason, when 64-bit came out, this number was implanted in our subconscious and was implanted in just the world and the way we discuss things, especially dealing with video games. Number 64. Why 64? Okay? This is where we're getting back into Chinese thought and Chinese philosophy. And this is the I Ching. Okay? So what we have with the I Ching and the principles of life is the yin and yang, right? So you have yin and yang here. So that's yin and yang. Normally they put like the little dots inside, but that's an entirely different thing that, if you're new to Taoism, people don't really recognize that. This is yin and yang. The little dots in there, while that's a nice little philosophical thing to talk about, it means something completely different. So this is what the source of creation is. Right before that you have emptiness. So I'll just say this is emptiness. And then it turns into duality. And from this, the 10,000 things are created. That's what's said in ancient Chinese philosophy. But 10,000 things just means like a lot. A lot of things can be created through this. So how does this relate to 64? So in the I Ching, what these people discussed about a lot, these ancient philosophers, these ancient sages, they realized that there was these combinations of yin and yang that were present. And there's 8 primary, they call them gua. So gua, G-U-A. So you have the 8 primary gua, which is fire, water, heaven, earth, metal or lake, wood or wind, thunder, and mountain. So those are the 8 primary gua that exist, and I can draw them out for you here. So you have heaven, which is 3 yang lines. So I'll just quickly say, like, a straight line is yang, and a line where there's a cut in the middle of it, that means yin. So you have 3 lines, that's heaven. You have 3 dashed lines, that's earth. 1 full line in the middle, you have a dashed line, and then on the outside you have a full line, that's fire. Then the opposite of that is water. Then you have full line on top, 2 dashed underneath, that's mountain. Then you have dash, line, that's meadow or lake, depending on your mode of thought. Then you have 2 full lines and a dash line, that's wood or wind. I use wind more primarily, it makes more sense. And then you have, this is 7. And then then you have thunder at the bottom. So this is the 8 primary gua, right? And you can see in a lot of like Chinese kung fu symbols that you might find scattered about online or in stores, you're going to see these symbols sort of like circling around some kind of like Chinese symbol or whatnot, and you're going to find these a lot everywhere. And there's a lot of things that you can do with these alchemically, there's a lot of things philosophically you can come up with these things, but these are the 8 primary gua, and that's the 3 layers of things. But with the I Ching, what they realized was that there was the hexagram, and that's where everything fits into the physical world, where you take one of these 8 gua and you stack them on top of each other, and then you create the bigger gua, whatever, the hexagram. And within those hexagrams, there are 64 possible combinations, okay? So that's where 64 comes from. 64 is the 64 possible combinations of yin and yang in the physical world in terms of what things could happen. And anytime you combine one of these gua together, it creates a circumstance, so to speak. So I have an I Ching book. If you're not familiar with it, you can take time to research it. So I'm just going to pick something randomly here. So here we go. Gua number 28, great exceeding. So this you have metal over wind. And so if I'm going to draw this out for you here, I'll do it at the bottom. So that's what that looks like. This is just an example of what that will represent. I'm not really going to go into it, but that's an example. And what this would mean, if I'm going to go read it, it means great exceeding. So, right, so just when things are great. We'll read one of the poems that are described to this. Great exceeding, the ridgepole sags, favorable to have somewhere to go, prosperous and smooth. Great exceeding, it indicates that the exceeding is great. The ridgepole says 2 ends are weak. The firm exceeds the yielding at the central place. Smooth and joyous in action, favorable to have somewhere to go, this is success. Truly great is the time of great exceeding. So that's just an example of what this could represent in terms of a change. That's what the I Ching represents. It represents the book of changes, right? So we're in a state of life, in a state of living in our lives day to day. We're going to go through different circumstances and different scenarios where we're dealing with life on a day-to-day basis. And they believe, the sages, that everything can be attributed down to this kind of gua, this kind of combination of yin and yang in the hexagram format. And there are 64 possible different combinations and 64 different states of being that you are going to find yourself in at any given time. This is the state of the video game world. And this is why 64-bit and Nintendo 64 was utilized so importantly during this time, because that's what it represented. And also, if you think about 64 and 64-bit and Nintendo 64, what did Nintendo 64 do that no other console did before? It created the 3D game, the 3-dimensional game. Every single game console before that was 2-dimensional. You had a side scroller, you had a guy moving this way. Now all of a sudden with 64-bit, now I can go forward and back and side to side and jump up and down, go all over the place if I wanted to. And this completely changed everything about how video games were created and made. And it was all because of 64. It created the max output of where we can now finally live in a 3-dimensional world in virtual reality, so to speak. And this is very relevant. It's all connected here of what 64 represents. And if we want to think about when we go into computers and yin and yang, What is yin and yang ultimately? Ones and zeros. That's what all programming is based off. It's based off a binary system. And before we have programming, the binary code, we have source. We have emptiness. We have emptiness as form, whatever you want to call it. And this is where the number 7 comes in, as I've said before. So, I've kind of talked a lot about all of this, and there's a lot you can go into and delve into research here. But I want to illustrate a little other concept here about what this represents here, about the hexagram, and why the Star of David is different from the hexagram. Because the hexagram is, just this shape minus the little corners here. But the corners are there for a reason. The corners aren't just there for show, right? Because ultimately this is a symbol of Judaism. This is a symbol that we use to represent ourselves as Jews, right? So even though this is following within the law, there is an aspect that's going almost beyond it with these triangles here. And if we think about each side as being, let's say, the 6 thieves or the 6 senses, we can see that it starts off at the base. We have these senses, and then we peak themselves, and we kind of start eliminating as we go along for each sense. We start eliminating the need for these senses, and this is where enlightenment comes from. So that's ultimately what this represents. It represents the pure divine enlightenment from the physical world when we think about it, because we have the hexagram, which just represents the physical world. This is what it is. When we have the points here, we have the physical sides of reality, the 6 different senses that we experience on a day-to-day basis, and chipping away at them gradually until we reach a point of singularity, a point of emptiness, a point of nothingness, to where these senses are no longer a part of our day-to-day lives. And this is where the Buddhists believed, and a lot of other people believe this too, of finding enlightenment. And this is the aspect of Kabbalah as well. In Kabbalah, which means receiving or tradition, reception of tradition. In order to be receptive to the universe, you have to be completely empty. You have to be an empty receptacle. You can't be full of something. And this is kind of a symbol of emptying out what is in the physical world, emptying out what is in our day-to-day lives. And once we attain that nothingness, we get ultimately to 0, or you can say we get to 7, the day of rest. We've completed the work week. We've completed all the days where we are doing something. And we've eliminated everything until we're at a place of rest where we can fully be one with God and the universe and whatsoever. So I'm going to touch upon other aspects as well. One of them is the fact that there's a lot of tendency to sort of think that Jews are satanic because we worship the Sabbath on Saturday, which is known as Saturn's Day, and good Christians worship on Sunday. There's a very real reason why we celebrate on Saturday, and that's because we didn't invent the calendar system. We didn't invent the Roman calendar system. That's a paganist invention. Paganist meaning the Christians that invented that system decided that the Jews are going to get the Saturday because we don't like them, and we're going to get the Sunday because the sun is the best day. It's, the sun is everything. That's what gives everything life, so we're going to take that. So that's just like a little clear up of that aspect of why people like to criticize the Jews for worshiping God on Saturday, which means we're Satanists and we worship Saturn. That's not really the point. So why do we use this as a symbol? It comes down to a lot of aspects. It comes down to mainly the fact that we follow the law. But there's also another connotation to this symbol being utilized in other cultures, and one of them is in, I don't know if I should say Hinduism, but in Vedic aspects, in Vedic spirituality, we can see this a lot as being attributed to the heart chakra, right? The Star of David, if you want to call it that, is very much attributed to the heart and the heart's desires. So why do we attribute this to the heart? And the heart is where we make our prayers, right? The way we communicate with God, we communicate from the heart. This is a very traditional Jewish, at least, aspect, and it's in Christianity as well. If we want to pray to God, if we want to become one with God, we become one with the universe. If we want to pray, whatever, it comes from the heart, direct from the heart to the outside world. And this is kind of the aspect where we're looking at here, where we can become one with the entire world. The heart is connected to the entire universe. Every single possible outcome and probability comes from the heart, and we can sort of express that way. And people like to think the heart is this good and pure notion. The heart isn't necessarily good. The heart is filled with desires and lusts and passions and desires to take over and dominate others. It's not just a period of feeling like, I'm one with God and everything's great. There's a lot of passions from the heart that are very toxic. And this is where, if we go back into traditional Chinese medicine, their belief was to make sure the heart was empty, that the heart was a receptacle, so that way it was pure, and everything that you're receiving from the universe, rather than just constantly wanting to put stuff out, like, I want this in the world. God, give me this, please. And this is where we can see the Star of David again, where we can see those points entering a place of singularity. So where we're not confined to the physical world anymore, we're not confined to physical desires, we're not confined just to the laws, we can become one with Source again. And that's ultimately what this all represents, right? It all represents a divinity-defined source, and understanding that the universe is as it is, and we have to follow the laws no matter what. Even if we can find one with Source again, we still have to wake up from our meditative trance and go out and go grocery shopping and communicate with our family and deal with the real world. And this is very dealing with realistic aspects in the world of our relationship with the law and relationship with order and structure of the universe, and just in our day-to-day lives with the police, with what's happening in the world. We're having a lot of issues accepting this, right? Accepting this as a reality, and we want things to change. And people need to realize that law is going to exist whether we like it or not. There's no such thing as a free world. There's always going to be a structure, there's always going to be an order that we have to follow. And all we can do is make sure that this order is bound by a divine source, a divine will, and not just this egotistical manifestation of this is what I believe is law, right? That's why it comes down to the heart again. The heart believes that this is what it wants. This is what I want. It's selfish to think that way. I want this. I want to have $1 million. I don't care if I have to kill people. This is what I want. This is my passion. And you utilize the universe, the world, the aspects of the world. You utilize the probabilities and the ratios and the chances that exist everywhere in the universe to make sure that happens, right? You're a master of the universe, of the world. If you can do that, you are able to manipulate the universe. But just because you're stuck in this box and you're manipulating it, and you're a really good gamer and you get all the points and you get all the trophies and you get all the level ups, whatever, the upgrades in the video game, but you're still not going to become one with this source. You're not going to become free from the physical world, right? You're not going to become free from this hexagram unless you attribute yourself to the points, the stars that are surrounding the hexagram that help you break free from the confines of the cube. So next time you look at one of these things, remember what I taught you today. So I'm going to go through a reading list here. So number 1, obviously, is the I Ching. This is a very traditionally based aspect. There's the Wilhelm version, which is the more popular one. I bought this. It's written by a Chinese guy, Alfred Huang, who was in prison for 22 years in prison. Okay, so, and all he did while he was in prison, because he was arrested by the Communist Party, because he was part of like a martial arts program, and they thought he was going to, fight against them or whatever. But, he takes it from a very traditional standpoint, and while he was in prison, that was basically all he did was study and learn about the I Ching. And, you get a much more, I guess, traditional viewpoint of what it is. You can look at the Wilhelm version. I haven't personally read it, but, when you come to these things, it's very subjective. You just want to make sure that you're learning it from someone who's experienced and knows these concepts very well, obviously. Then another book I will take a look at here is the Torah, okay? This is a Jewish Torah, so you're not going to find what's written in here necessarily in the King James Bible or whatnot. You can get this art scroll. You can go online, you can buy a copy of it yourself. It's about $45, which is pretty damn cheap considering the quality of this book. It's like leather bound. It's like really nice. And not only do you get the Torah, obviously, you get it in Hebrew, obviously, but you get a lot of commentary of it as well. So you're seeing it from a lot of different interpretations, and you're getting a lot of history and culture as well that you're learning about, because this version of the Torah or the Pentateuch, whatever you want to call it, is it's different than the King James version. It's not the same thing. The interpretations are different. The interpretations of let's say, for example, the story of Jacob and Esau. In the King James version, and generally in Christianity, the interpretation is that Jacob wrestled with God. In the Torah, they call him the angel of death, or Satan, or some other aspect, which is a lot more interesting, because if we think about it as Satan, we're going back to this structure of Saturn with the hexagram that's on top. Saturn is the governor of law, the governor of death, right? And we wrestle with that. We wrestle with the real world, we wrestle with the universe. And the universe is trying to tell us this is the law, and we fight with it until we become one with Source. We become one with Seven. We rest and we become one with the Source again. And this is when Jacob, when he wrestled with this and he became one to terms of the physical world, that was when he was granted the name of Israel. And Israel is the representation of that struggle, of the struggle of mankind, of trying to overcome our difficulties of dealing with the world and the six senses and the six thieves, and that was what the Buddha taught as well. So it's all related there. Another thing is Cultivating the Tao by, what's his name? Liu Yiming. So this is an interesting book. It's definitely a lot more difficult. I would do a lot more research into Taoism and internal alchemy before actually getting into this, but this is a book I read where I sort of started understanding more the concepts of 6 versus 7 and what 7 represents as a whole, how 7 represents the source of all life, the source of all creation. And, definitely a good book. I would just do a lot more research before actually getting into it. Another book here, we have Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics. The reason why I picked this, because it doesn't really talk necessarily about any of this kind of stuff. It talks primarily about ethics and holding yourself accountable to certain things in your life. The reason why I'm picking this is because it focuses on balance of things. There's no good or bad. There's only imbalances of qualities that you have in life. And when you're out of balance, that's when you're bound to certain aspects of the cube, right? And you want to escape from the cube. And the only way to do that is to find balance and to find harmony. And once you do that, you find balance in everything in your life, then you can kind of start cutting away from all of these aspects, and you become one with 7 and the source of all life and all that shit, right? So that's where this ultimately comes from, in terms of a Western perspective, a philosophical perspective, and it's the source of kind of all of that ethical aspects of philosophy, especially in the West. And it's a good book there. Now I'm getting into movies. I don't know why, but Shanghai Noon. If you want to see like just a good comedy buddy action movie of East meets West and their struggle of trying to find balance between each other, that's a good aspect. But there's also a sheriff in this movie who represents the law, right? Because they all break the law in this movie. They think everything's fun and game, like a nice little game, but you have to remember that there is the law behind you. And the imagery of this really evokes that Saturnian dark energy of like, if you want to fuck around with the law, you have to pay the consequences. And I'll bring that up again. That's karma, right? Cause and effect. That's the law. You can't just eliminate the law altogether. The law is just always going to be there. Karma is always going to be there. The only way to escape karma is to not engage with it at all, is to become one with Source again, become Source with emptiness. 7, that whole thing. And then another movie, this is like this anime, it's okay. I didn't particularly enjoy it that much, but the imagery and the symbolism and the theme of this anime is amazing. But in terms of actual plot and characters, I did not care for it at all. But just because of the imagery and just the general themes of it, of earth versus heaven, good versus evil, which it kind of eradicates that notion from existing. we realize that the world and everything in the universe is a lot more complicated than that. And this is where, it's called X, right? X, yeah, that's it. Just look up X anime. And X is also an interesting character, which is also very Saturnian and also dealing with the law. But it represents a lot of different things, because X also means 10. And you can pretty much do a whole other lecture on just the letter X and what that represents. But X can also represent this, the Star of David. But yeah, we'll leave it to rest for now. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.